CC. I was raised in the Mormon Church and left in my early 20s and have been a skeptic for the last 10 plus years. Comparisons between the LDS Church and Scientology seem to be commonplace, despite the fact that reality is different, at least as I see it. There are certainly bullet point similarities of the foundational history of both. However, I think that Mormons are much more family-oriented. Very few are excommunicated, family members are still allowed contact, and the church has non-member community services such as food, rent, bill assistance, and they are behind Ancestry.com. Although members are encouraged to make donations, not doing so will not result in financial investigations or severe pressure. They encourage community service, and most congregations have Boy Scout troops and young women groups where anyone can join. That opinion could be seen as my own bias, though. Scientology, on the other hand, well, you know, it's all about the almighty dollar and the willingness to ignore or outright destroy anyone who gets in the way. So why are comparisons of the two so common? Is it simply long-held stigmas maintained over time? I understand your knowledge about Mormons may be limited, but is there something I'm missing here? The comparison I use is the Nazis and the Boy Scouts. Sure, they both like to wear brown shirts, but by any really meaningful standard, one group is clearly more selfish, evil, and detrimental to society than the other. Love your channel and keep up the good work. All right, CC, big question. I have done numerous interviews with Jonathan Streeter, who is an ex-Mormon, that I would encourage you to watch if you haven't, because I think I've made myself pretty clear in those videos about why, and in the banter and talk between Jonathan and I, about the comparisons between Scientology and Mormonism. And there are more than a couple of points of valid comparison. And I do think that bias is showing through in your question, because you are whitewashing some of what the Mormon Church is about and what it's done in its history and in the present. Even to the point where in your own question you talk about how there are Boy Scout troops and girl groups where anyone can join, which is just not true, right? The Boy Scouts historically have not been open to members of the LGBTQ community, for example. So it's not true that the Boy Scouts are just wide open to anybody, right? Or at least historically that they have been. So it's not that the things you said about the Mormon Church are all false, or are not, that there's no community support, that they're not there for their neighbors, that there isn't a sense of companionship and camaraderie, I guess is really the word I was looking for there, between Mormons, right? Those are all good things. I got nothing against any of that. But when the latest episode I did with Jonathan Streeter just a few weeks ago talked about how Mormon bishops were calling in children and asking them in detail about their sexual activities, as to whether they've, maintained the laws of chastity or not. And if they haven't, they get very down and dirty sometimes, quizzing and interrogating these kids about their sexual practices. This is off the rails. The parents, in many cases, weren't even aware of the fact that this was happening. So how you can give that a pass, I'm really not sure, right? The Mormon Church, as I've said before, and I'll say this just to answer this question, then we can move on. I look at the Mormon Church as something that used to be a more destructive cult than it is now. It's gotten lax on and changed a lot of its policies over the years to become more mainstream and more accepting. For example, and the biggest one I can think of that is just demonstrates the point, was the fact that up until the 1970s, they thought that being black, being African American, or African period, any African descent, rather I should say, was a mark of Cain, right? I'm not making this up. This is what Mormons have told me, right? Is that this is how this was considered. And that black people were not able to be Mormons or gain high standing in the Mormon Church because of this. This is just outright racism. And it was written into the policies of the Mormon Church by its founders and its prophets. So then they had a revelation in the 70s and decided to change this centuries, or a century-old law about, the point of dogma, I should say, not really a law, it was more of a point of dogma, about black people, right? And now, in the modern Mormon Church, there's no stigma connected with being a black person, and yet there used to be. So what other stigmas exist now in the Mormon Church that, maybe you're not looking as critically at as you maybe should be. Those are the things that we have a problem with. And those are the things that we are speaking out about, right? We're being very specific about our disagreements and problems with Mormonism. It is not down with Mormonism, let's go burn all the churches and destroy the temple and nuke Utah from orbit. Right? It's the only way to be safe, right? That's not what we are preaching here on this channel, or what Jonathan Streeter and I talk about, right? We talk about specific abuses that go on in the church that need to be dealt with. And they are, in many ways, comparable with abuses that happen in Scientology. So, is Mormonism as bad as Scientology? That's kind of up to each individual to decide based on their own values and morals. I don't particularly think that they are, but I think that there are things going on in the Mormon Church that are absolutely unacceptable behavior, and I think those things need to be called out for what they are, and I think that they can be corrected. And that's my take on it overall.